Hi, my name is Christina Malishko, and I am going to be presenting the proposal that I made to implement a new system of marine protected areas along the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And I just want to welcome everyone for coming out today and making the time to listen to my proposal. So, first of all, I just want to welcome our patron, Michael Cameron, the CEO of the Great Barrier Reef Foundation in Australia, doing a lot of work with different coral conservation issues and just a great overall foundation that's working towards conservation for the Great Barrier Reef. So for a little overview, we're just going to start out with a little bit of a background about climate change and then move into how climate change is affecting the coral reefs in the ocean, and then focusing more on the current event happening in the Great Barrier Reef in terms of bleaching, and then moving into different conservation projects that are currently going on throughout Australia and the world to focus on different coral bleaching conservation methods and just overall climate change fixing, for lack of a better word, research that is being done right now and has been proven successful, surprisingly. And then we're going to go into my plan of action, which is going to be the marine protected areas redesign, and then how exactly I'm going to make that work, and then moving into our budget, how much is actually really going to cost the project to come to completion, and then finally my plan to evaluate the success of the project to see if it's actually working and how it's actually helping in the conservation of the Great Barrier Reef. So beginning off, we're going to talk about the greenhouse effect. So basically, starting during the Industrial Revolution, around like the 19th century, a lot of human industry started coming out with like factories and just producing a bunch of different products for mass production. And through that mass production, it induced a lot of chemicals to be released into the atmosphere. And those chemicals weren't usually like a natural in a natural concentration in the atmosphere, so that led to some issues in terms of how the earth like adapted to these conditions. So normally before the Industrial Revolution happened, the atmosphere has a process that is called the greenhouse effect. So they have greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, etc., that create a barrier up in the atmosphere, and that helps to lock in the sunlight's radiation so that basically the earth doesn't freeze over and we can actually have life on the earth. However, when you increase the CO2 due to processes like the industry and increased anthropogenic factors like driving cars, again, industry, or like farming, a lot of human activities basically, releasing a lot of the CO2 into the atmosphere, you create a lot more of those greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. And the more greenhouse gases you have in the atmosphere, the more CO2 it will hold, meaning that the more heat you're going to hold in the atmosphere as well, increasing the overall global temperature. So we see on the right side of the slide, you can see a little diagram of the greenhouse effect, the sun coming in and the heat remaining in the atmosphere. But again, that's not exactly what's happening right now. It's more of an intense circulation of heat. And below that, you can see the increase of the overall global temperature from around the start of the Industrial Revolution until I think that was picked from March, so like about the pretty most recent increase in temperature. So right now it is about a 0.98 degrees Celsius increase as seen on the graph here, which is about 2 degrees Celsius. It doesn't seem to be that big of an increase, but in terms of like the typical temperature that the Earth is, that's pretty large of an increase and can lead to a lot of different harmful factors for the environment. So this overall global increase of CO2 before the Industrial Revolution was about 280 parts per million ppm. And then as of March 2020, this was, I think, picked from like March 20th was the last average conducted. it was about 114.5 parts per million. As you can see in the chart on the right, has a very steep increase of CO2 throughout the last like 40 years, and it just keeps increasing every year, and there has really not been much of a decrease with the more industry and human activities that are making more pollution in our environment. So it's a very rapidly increasing issue that really needs to have some sort of regulation and conservation to help bring those levels back to a normal level. And as a little fun fact, these CO2 records were actually taken, they go back like hundreds and hundreds of years, and they are taken from ice core samples from different, like the poles or different large glacial regions, and they're also made from different like records that were started back in like the 1800s from different meteorological studies that have been done throughout time. So as we've seen, the atmosphere is a very large reservoir for these CO2 emissions. However, it's actually only the largest CO2 reservoir in the world. The ocean is actually the largest. It is actually estimated to hold 3.4 billion tons, which is about, I think, 5 times larger than what the atmosphere can hold. So, as you would think, the problems that the increase in CO2 is causing for the atmosphere and the overall global warming issues that we have seen throughout the last however many centuries is also happening in the ocean as well, and actually happening due to the magnitude of difference of the two sizes. It's actually happening on a larger scale, but the fact that the ocean is kind of more out of reach and you can't really see exactly what's happening from naked eye, humans usually don't focus on the harmful effects that are also happening in the ocean because they can't see it. If you can't see it, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But the ocean is also going to need some help decreasing these CO2 levels as well as the overall atmosphere does too. So, moving on to how CO2 is affecting the ocean. Overall, it's just leading to increases in sea surface temperature, acidification, so just more, the water is more acidic basically and breaks down and messes with a lot of different biological processes happening in the ocean, as well as it's disrupting the circulation in terms of thermohaline circulation, which is the temperature and salinity, salt content of the water. So the less cold, the more dense, more cold waters at the bottom, warmer, less salty, and that creates a circulation throughout the ocean. And it's also leading to a lot of ecosystems to break down and a lot of destruction in different animal habitats and animals that are being able to live in these harmful conditions and being able to tolerate these warmer, very harmful conditions to their environment. And out of all of the ecosystems in the ocean, coral reefs are actually getting the hardest hit because they're built to tolerate a very strict set of conditions due to the fact that they are very low nutrient and high light. So over like the 100,000 years they've been in existence, they've evolved to stick to these very strict conditions of pH, temperature, nutrients, etc. And with climate change, they have been taking a hard hit because it has changed their environment so drastically, and they have trouble actually surviving and tolerating these conditions. So why this is actually important is because coral reefs are actually one of the most diverse ecosystems in the whole entire world, as has been stated by a researcher from, I'm pretty sure, the University of Florida, Professor Glynn. He said that coral reefs are actually the tropical rainforest of the sea. So if you think about the rainforest in, say, the Amazon, how much biodiversity and how many different animals and species you see throughout the rainforest, think of that, but on a very larger scale in the ocean. How how many plants, animals, different interactions that are happening in the ocean are actually happening right there in the coral reef. So that's why without them, we would have a very less diverse ecosystem in the whole entire ocean, leading to food chain issues, and it just kind of spirals out of control without having different coral reefs throughout the world's environment. So to see on the right, that's actually a picture of a coral that has been affected by climate change, and it has led to a bleaching effect, which we will get into in the next slide. So due to the fact that climate change has caused their conditions to be all messed up, corals have taken a very hard hit from climate change. So we're going to get into exactly like what a coral is and how exactly they're affected by climate change. So before we start out, before you think about how the corals are being affected, we're going to clear up one misconception about corals that many people have. Corals are actually not plants. They're living, breathing animals like you and me. They may be on a smaller scale and not resemble an actual animal, but they are in fact an animal. So, I actually have a piece to show you guys. So, a coral is basically, it's a smaller scale, but it is built with a calcium carbonate shell or skeleton that is mounted on the reef, and it consists of tiny little polyps that you can see here live all in the little holes of the calcium carbonate shell. And also you can see on this one, a smaller scale where the polyps would be located on the coral. But these polyps are actually individual animals, and a whole entire coral is a colony of these tiny polyps. So a coral is actually more than one animal, but it's an animal. So these tiny polyps are very similar to a jellyfish, as you see in the top picture. They have that kind of tentacly little appearance to them, and inside the polyps, they have these tiny microalgae called zooxanthellae, and these zooxanthellae are photosynthetic since they are animals. They're plants, algae plants, and they take energy from the sun and provide that energy towards the polyp in a symbiotic relationship. So the polyps give the zooxanthellae a home to survive and prosper throughout the conditions, and then they provide the polyps with an energy source. The polyps also get their color from these zooxanthellae, and once they're in these unstable conditions, like the climate change conditions, they will actually expel themselves, and since they're metabolically compromised due to the increase in temperature and light and many issues caused by climate change. And the expelling of the zooxanthellae from the polyps leaves only these clear-looking polyps on the calcium carbonate shell, which basically leaves them discolored and basically white, which is called a process we like to call bleaching, which is just the release of the zooxanthellae from the polyps. And the coral isn't actually dead. The polyps can take back the zooxanthellae once the conditions do return to normal in the cycle of a bleaching event. It will eventually subside, and the polyps can go back to having their little algae friends living back inside them. But as climate change is getting worse and these bleaching events are happening more consecutively, the revitalization of the corals, getting back their algae, is actually decreasing, and a lot of the corals are dying and not revitalizing themselves and getting their algae back in them to survive, because without the algae, they cannot produce enough energy to survive on their own. They can eat and bring in food particles, but it's not enough to actually fully survive. So that's why they need some kind of help to kind of stabilize the conditions and hopefully create some kind of solution to help them have better revitalization from these bleaching events. So, since these coral reefs are a large part of the overall ocean ecosystem, they actually have, besides from the biodiversity effect being so large, they actually have a large economic impact on humans like us. So they are very important to us too. So since they're usually closer to the shore, they provide a storm and surf buffer from the coastal communities, leading to less flooding and less damage from a lot of hurricanes and storms with a lot of ocean influence. They also provide many pharmaceuticals. A lot of companies will take compounds from the corals themselves and turn them into a variety of different drugs for different conditions. And they're also known for a food source because a lot of the reef fish are very um, highly like wanted fish for a lot of people around the world, and people like to fish them. So they need those to survive in a lot of areas. They also provide many jobs in terms of tourism, fishing, and research. And without having these large parts of the ocean for people to work in, a lot of jobs will be lost. So it has actually been calculated that reefs provide $375 billion to the global economy every year, which, if you think about it in retrospect, is a very large amount of money to the world. So without them, again, that'd be a very hard hit to the economy. And in terms of one reef in general, which is the largest reef and the one which has the most impact on the world's oceans, is the Great Barrier Reef, and that was estimated to be worth $56 billion from taking surveys from different people around Australia and how much they would invest in the Great Barrier Reef, and a lot of them invested like $75. Isn't too much, but thinking about how that is over the whole entire continent, that adds up and gets $56 billion. And it's been calculated that it produces and provides $6.4 billion to the overall economy of Australia. So again, without the Great Barrier Reef, the Australian economy would again crash due to this very large economic input to their economy. So as you can see in this picture, the Great Barrier Reef is in the northeastern section of the Australian continent, and it takes up almost half of their eastern coast, which is a very large area, if you think about it. Half of a continent is a very large area. So that's why it's the largest it can be seen from space, fun fact, and it's one that really needs some help due to its overall size and intense biodiversity throughout the whole entire reef system. So currently, if you have seen the news or heard anything about Australia and the Great Barrier Reef, there's actually a bleaching event happening. Well, it happened a couple weeks ago, but it's still in the works, happening right now. The intense part of it happened more in the beginning of March. As you can see from these diagrams taken from a model made from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a U.S. federal funded organization that does a lot of work in different ocean and atmospheric issues. So they have a special program that watches reefs around the world, and they have tracked the progression of this bleaching event and others throughout time. So you can see that this one was actually one of the worst to have occurred in Australian history. There was a very large one that happened in 2016-2017. This one is predicted to have a very much larger impact. So you can see, starting back in March, and the 10th it started, was a very, 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 very destructive bleaching event in an alert 2 for most of the Great Barrier Reef. And as time has passed, it has subsided as conditions have changed, and the weather and the winds and the cloud cover have moved and transitioned around. But overall, it has stayed pretty strong and predominant for a pretty long period of time, which leads to, again, a lot of destruction for the reef. And currently, these are conditions as of today of the Great Barrier Reef. As you can see, there's a very small yellow region along the interior of the reef, but overall the bleaching event has subsided, and as things usually happen, it should be entering its revitalization phase, but that's always hard to tell if it actually will revitalize or just kind of die out as time has passed, which will take some more time to record and understand what else is happening in the reef as of this last bleaching event. So as I mentioned, compared to the 2017 and 2016 bleaching events, they were the worst bleaching events in history that Australia has ever seen. And they destroyed most of the northern half of the reef, so that would be around up here. And they spared much of the southern part of the reef, which is usually what happens in a bleaching event in Australia. However, this current bleaching event is a lot worse due to the fact that it is affecting the whole entire reef system and has lasted a longer duration and has a very much stronger intensity. You can see from the different colors. This is an alert 2 we saw from before, and the layer red is an alert 1 and also just a warning. So there was a very strong, a much stronger bleaching event this time around. However, the strange thing about this bleaching event is the fact that it's not during an El Nino year, which the cold water and the warm water kind of flip-flop in the Pacific Ocean during certain years in order, for lack of a better word. So that's how that usually happens with bleaching events during an El Nino year, causing the very strange, very warming conditions as you'd see in a bleaching event. So that is showing that this bleaching event is caused primarily on anthropogenic factors and climate change and increased temperatures, and has actually seen since January that the overall temperature in that region has been a lot higher than the stress tolerance for that ocean general area can contain. It's been about a degree warmer than usual and that it can hold. So the area has been a lot warmer than usual, leading to bleaching events because of climate change, basically. So as you see, climate change and bleaching events are a very large issue and something that is very a big research project in the area of marine science. So coral reefs are actually covering only 0.2% of the whole entire ocean floor, and even though they are such a small fraction of the ocean, they're actually one of the largest areas of marine conservation research throughout the whole entire field. So as you can see, they're pretty important to me as a scientist. So there are many projects throughout the marine conservation area of science, and primarily you see a very drastic difference in them. So that can be from modifying the genes of the corals to help reduce their stress response, or that can be revamping marine protected areas throughout a selected reef area. So from the research you can see that it is possible to save a fraction of the reef, especially if you're focusing on like a certain reef area, but you can't actually save a whole entire reef. But to make some progress, it's best to focus on the largest reefs that will have the largest impact. So for our study, we're going to be focusing on the largest reef, the Great Barrier Reef, since it has the drastic size and surface area for the ocean. And I found that looking through many studies and different projects, we're focusing on bleaching and different climate change effects, that focusing on marine protected areas is the most cost and labor effective, just due to the less complicated and more accessible that this form of conservation is for a project of my size and funding. So marine protected area is basically a region of the ocean in a reef system that has a regulation in it, or a couple of regulations, to reduce human activity and the impact they have on the reef in order to support rehabilitation and resilience to further bleaching events. This just allows basically for the reef to help revitalize itself and help heal itself after the bleaching event, to consider continue to prosper and survive for a longer period of time than it would be with human impacts. So one study was conducted in 2017 from a couple universities in Brazil, Australia, and the UK, and they were trying to see how, if you kind of manipulated different parameters of marine protected areas throughout the Great Barrier Reef, how that would affect the survival and the survival rates and the different like coral cover and different aspects of a coral health assessment. So they proposed that the MPAs should be a very substantially larger size and cover a larger area in the ocean, and also have stricter fishing and diving rules to help have the most prosperous and successful MPA in the selected reef area. So they took into consideration many multidisciplinary conservation methods to model their success. So they considered biodiversity, connectivity, and global warming as their main three factors they're going to focus on, and how they all had their own set of successes and failures throughout their study. So they found the ones focused on global warming were the most successful. As you can see in the graph on the right, as highlighted with the little purple shape here, they had an average of 44% of increased survival rate, as seen with the dot here, and global warming had a lot more consistent and overall consistent and just overall just consistent data in survival rates and the health and overall revitalization of the reef compared to the other two aspects they looked at. And the global warming also had a 65% increase in the overall INSET objective achievement. So that means basically that those sites had accomplished many of the objectives that they wanted, which was the highest of the three of the studies. So basically the global warming had the best, most consistent data that was showing the best results for the area they're looking at. And also, I'm going to focus on a study from 2019 from a group of researchers in the Great Barrier Reef that were focusing on no-take zones in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. So they were trying to manipulate the size and location of these no-take zones to see how the biological impacts on biodiversity was going to impact a bleached reef. So a little history of this. The government, back in 2004, they turned the overall marine park from 4.5% of no-take zones to 33% of the total reef being no-take zone. And even though that would seem to be successful, there's actually limited data on that study of how that impacted the reef and how it helped to promote the resilience and the revitalization of the reef. So it was conducted to be invalid, so they couldn't use that data. So they decided to make their own study doing a similar manipulation of the no-take zones. And again, we can see that just having government rule is not enough to promote coral reef conservation. So in this study, you can see in the graphs on the right, there was a very low negative impact from increasing and manipulating the no-take zones. However, as you can see, kind of controversial data in the neutral and positive parts of the study, there was actually a very, compared to the negative, a very large increase in positive impacts. However, the neutral impact kind of overshined the whole entire study. But the thing with that is this is an ongoing study that is currently still collecting data and seeing how the impacts are continuing to influence the reef. So those neutral areas did not actually have enough time to decide if they wanted to be shown positive or negative. So if this study continued on, you would see that most likely they'd go more towards the positive because the trend is more positive in the study, but it's 50-50. But from this, you can see that there was still an increase from positive impacts. So you can say that the no-take zone was a positive impact for the reef due to the fact that it is substantially larger than what the negative impacts were. So it's pretty impactful for the reef. As you can see on the right here, this is a study done again in the Great Barrier Reef, looking at fish populations, and due to the fact that in these selected areas they saw with no take zones and fishing zones, there was a large increase in fish populations. I didn't include that in the actual successful research part of my presentation due to the fact that they weren't focusing on corals, more focused on the fish populations. But again, you can see that in these MPAs with no take zones, there was a very drastic increase in the biodiversity, but in terms of fish. So again, it seems to have an increase, but not really helpful for what I'm trying to prove here. In terms of my plan of how I'm going to make this whole thing happen, as you can see from the first study, changing the size to be substantially larger of the MPAs throughout the reef is going to be a very important factor to the success of the MPAs and how revitalization happens inside of the reef. So we're going to focus more on the damaged areas throughout the reef, having MPAs mostly in those areas to help really pack in the resilience and rehabilitation of those areas. We're also going to create a set of regulations throughout these MPAs that are going to incorporate both no-take zones and open fishing. Again, as you saw in this mapped out study here, having both open fishing and no-take zones does increase the biodiversity of the area. And also you can see that in the second study terms of the positive and neutral impacts of no-take zones. And as I've seen in my times out on the ocean and diving personally, in marine parks, having a set of moorings in certain areas to promote diving at certain dive sites is actually a very beneficial factor for saving the reef from people anchoring and throwing their anchor over and damaging the reef, or going into an area that's not really the best to dive in, so they can have diving in concentrated areas and not in areas that are probably not the best to see and not the best people to be touching and kind of exploring around. So that's another little thing we can put into regulation. And then also there's the idea of having patrol boats surveying the selected areas. So that's going to be both for regulation and to do some reef survey from the shallow reef, so they can see how the health of the corals are changing throughout time, and also to help regulate the different boat traffic in the area to help people stay out of the MPAs and to make sure they're in the right areas in the ocean. So also, the country of Australia is having a Reef 2050 plan to help revitalize the reef by the year 2050, and they have a lot of independent scientists that can be joined on their team. So I'm actually trying to become one of those scientists and have this project be implemented in their plan to help further it along and make more progress with their successful plan to help, again, save the reef. So as mentioned before, we are partnering with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and Michael Cameron, the CEO. They're just a very large foundation with many people donating and working with them to help fund projects that are working on a large scale impact, like the whole entire reef, basically, like I'm doing along the Great Barrier Reef. And I'm also working directly with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. So you can kind of help with regulation and just having the in with the right people to have the right things happen in the program. And they're also working with the 2050 plan as well. So that's another way that we can contribute to that plan. But also being a part of their science team, we're going to work with their plan. And that plan is basically taking everyone from the government, scientists, and people like you guys to bring management and protection to the Great Barrier Reef from issues like climate change and different bleaching events. So they provide funding as well for independent scientists. So we're both getting funding from the foundation and the government to help further along this project. And they actually have an idea to decrease Australian carbon emissions by 2030 by about 26-28%, which will drastically help to curb further climate change and global warming issues leading to bleaching events and other issues in the ocean and also on the planet. So in terms of budget, this is, as you can see, a pretty pricey project. However, we are focusing on a very large area of the ocean, as well as conservation and management and regulation of the Great Barrier Reef, which is a very large task to take on. So I found a study, the same one that was from our first conservation research project, and that calculated the estimated cost of making new MPAs and also expanding the current MPAs, as well as the management that it takes to upkeep these areas. So that was around $4 million, 4.3, depending on which situation you were taking on. So in terms of my project, I would pick one of those, which is mainly building the new ones due to the fact that there really isn't any MPAs in the whole entire Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. So I need to establish a lot of them, which is the more cost-effective of the two, but again, it's still $4 million. My idea was to have 2 large patrol boats that I've estimated from a fishing boat cost profile. Being in terms of what I've calculated, that's about $370,000, but if we are working with the Marine Park Authority and the Reef 2050 plan, we can probably get boats regulation from them. So having these 2 patrol boats in our fleet, as well as the ones we can get from those 2 organizations, will help to have a large fleet of regulation throughout the whole entire Marine Park. And we're also going to have a small research team, about 4 researchers, that's going to help with health surveys and different surveys to be done throughout the whole duration of our project that will kind of see and track the health of the reefs throughout the time and just seeing if this whole thing is successful. So I estimated that to be about $7,500 for a year of these divers, because they're not going to be really out on the reef for too long due to the fact that you can only go for like an hour, maybe less, with a standard scuba tank. So in that mindset, as well as having not too many MPAs to study and survey, they won't need too much time in the ocean to have funding for. So it's not really too much of a commitment in terms of funding. So overall, our project will be about $4.5 million, but that can vary from different aspects of things happening here and there. As I mentioned with the research team, in terms of evaluating the success of our projects, we're having that small team, as well as citizen scientists. There are people like you, me, anyone that can dive, and they can go out and do some surveys on the reef without having funding. A lot of the times they will pay you to come out and do some science with you guys. So that's also a way to have more funding as well. That wasn't included in budget since it's not too big of a input of funding. So having both the citizen scientists as well as the researchers having health assessments, benthic and reef habitat surveys, as well as mapping the fringing reef and seeing how it is expanding and contrasting throughout the time. We'll be able to see how the growth and survival of these reefs throughout the Great Barrier Reef is changing throughout time, and how, if there is an increase or pretty stable conditions, we can see if it's successful or not. So, in conclusion, this is tackling a very mass crisis like bleaching, and that's a problem that cannot be solved by one small group or one person like myself. So it's going to take a large cooperative effort from different organizations of people and projects to see a substantial change, like in the Reef 250 plan, which is already in place. But again, it's going to take things like that to fix the global bleaching problem. And again, climate change has been a factor that has been happening for hundreds of years, and it's not going to happen overnight. So this is going to take years and years, a lot of funding, a lot of hard work, a lot of cooperation, and a lot of funding to help solve the global crisis of climate change, and as well as coral bleaching. And overall, if we only save a small portion of the reef and see pretty much almost full recovery to that small section, that is a success. So saving any part of the reef is a success in my eyes and of different marine conservation scientists as well. So that is all that I have to say. These are my references if you want to refer to any of them or read up on more of what people are doing with the coral conservation community. And if you have any further questions, you can ask them now, or feel free to contact me by email, by phone. I'm always available to explain the plan, or if you want to join the team or help make this plan possible. So I want to thank you for coming out today, listening to my proposal, and hopefully you learned something and want to help the coral reefs as well. So thank you very much, and enjoy your day.